Now, you know it's bad for the Democrats when they've gotten the New York Times worried about how they're handling education. Now, liberal columnist Michelle Goldberg sees the signs flashing red going all the way into 2022. It's what we've been saying since April 2020 here on The Angle, that Democrats desperately need schools to get back to normal. Well, public schools may finally be open across the country, but in many districts, things are far from normal. In Fairfax County, an unvaccinated student, she writes, identified as a close contact of someone who tests positive for COVID, must quarantine for 14 days no matter the results of the student's own COVID tests. And at some schools, students have been forbidden, she writes, to talk during lunch. And then further from Ms. Goldberg, at her own kids' school, students must be masked even during outdoor recess. She goes on to cite a different school problem in the Michigan schools have been forced to close because of staff shortages. Classrooms are doubled up and principals are acting as substitutes as pools of candidates dwindle. She writes this is a complicated problem, but it sums up it's up to the state's Democratic governor as well as the Biden administration to solve it. Wow. Now, since the early days of the pandemic, The Angle tried to warn Democrats that locking down schools would damage children and the economies in states that refused to open up. Now, it was obvious to anyone except the rankest of partisans that life had essentially returned to normal in states run by more conservative governors. So in Florida, South Dakota, Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, parents had kids in school and they were learning last spring and even last fall. Yet the Democrats running these other states and the school boards that are just dominated by teachers' union influence, they simply didn't care. So they ignored warnings and pleas from parents and from us, from everybody. But beyond the closures and the mask mandates, parents also began to see the garbage their kids were actually being taught. The most depressing and racialized, sexualized course content taught by generally activists who were masquerading as educators. So moms and dads describe the situation kind of as a 1-2 punch to the solar plexus. But rather than getting knocked out, parents punched back. Hence the victory in Virginia and the nail-biter in New Jersey. And parents began organizing and even saw some gains in school board races in places like left-leaning Colorado. Challengers forced liberal school board members in Colorado to spend big money to defend their seats. Still, conservatives picked up seats in Colorado's Douglas County, Mesa County, Colorado Springs, and Greeley. It's not bad. Things went the other way with voters in some of the more liberal areas. Denver suburbs, Wayzata, Minnesota, and Guilford, Connecticut, just to name a few. Apparently, those jurisdictions can't get enough of the negative lectures on white privilege and diversity, equity, inclusion. They want more of that. The decline in our public education system tracks the other parts of the country where the Democrats have dominated. So your average city public school in Baltimore is going to be about as well run as the Baltimore City Council runs the city of Baltimore. Ditto for Chicago, Hartford, Connecticut, and LA. And in Sunrise Park Middle School in Minnesota, rather than raising the bar for students, they decided to remove standards altogether.
Grades will not include behaviors, attitude, tardiness to class, whether the assignment was turned on later on time. This is really increasing the rigor of grades.
Students are encouraged to retake, revise quizzes, papers, projects.
And the other thing that you probably noticed is that we're not using anything under 50%. We want our students to know that learning takes work.
Yeah, teaching actually takes work too. And instead of adopting smart policies, what they're doing is just pandering to the unions, to the race radicals, to the gender benders. Today, we see where 40 years of neglect and politicization has gotten us. And the New York Times' Michelle Goldberg and every other liberal out there should know that the reason schools haven't gotten back to normal and they're doing nonsense like that is because the left doesn't want them to go back to normal. They don't want the old standards. To them, schools are nothing but anti-American propaganda outlets. that they then use to separate children from the racist, sexist, traditional views of their parents. So teaching American history, as many of us learned it, is out of the question now. Because remember, most of us grew up loving our country despite her flaws. The left needs an army of new recruits in its climate change and anti-racism revolution. And the schools are their trusted source. And now they have their puppet in the White House helping them too. Biden's goal is to make things easier for the teachers' unions. Kids and what's good for them, about 999th on his priority list. Now, this was obvious early on in his presidency when he backtracked on his promise that a majority of schools would be open for in-person learning by spring.
His goal that he set is to have the majority of schools, so more than 50%, open by day 100 of his presidency. And that means some teaching in classrooms, so at least 1 day a week.
Oh, 1 day a week! That was so pathetic. The unions also, of course, got a huge payout in Biden's so-called American Rescue Plan, and American parents and their kids, in turn, got ripped off. But the ripoff didn't begin with COVID and George Floyd. The fact is, conservatives have been losing ground in education for decades. Remember the attacks on great books classes, on Western civilization in general, the anti-nuke protests on campus in the 1980s, and heck, professors and students, remember, had to take a mental health day after Trump won the presidency.
For those mourning the Trump victory, colleges are offering comfort with everything from hot chocolate to Play-Doh.
I know that, speaking for myself as a gay man, I was very concerned about the outcome of the election and what it might mean for my own rights, so I assumed that students would be as well. So I sent an email saying, if you don't feel like you want to be there, that's fine, let me know. And most of the students took me up on that offer.
Shocker. Students don't want to go to class. But now parents are realizing that the radicalization isn't starting in colleges. No, it's starting long before that. And over the past 18 months, many now parents are voting with their feet, choosing homeschooling, parochial, and other religious schools. Or they're just moving to a red state where their rights are protected and kids' education priorities are put first. And think about this insanity. Instead of listening to the concerns of those who are paying the bills, the school boards in the blue states responded by limiting access to things like school board meetings or just canceling the meetings altogether. They kicked out and arrested dissenting parents, and then they urged the Justice Department to investigate the parents as potential terrorists. And the whole time, they denied that radical racial views are even being taught in the schools at all. Facts never get in the far left's way, never. And they always have the media to cover for them.
Parents know their kids are being indoctrinated with critical race theory in Virginia, and the Democrats wanted to deny it.
And so well, it's not in the curriculum.
Showed up because they don't like being lied to.
Just to be clear, it's not in the curriculum in Virginia.
Just to be... Brianna, would you like me to... Here, let me just read you a few things. In 2015, while Terry McAuliffe was governor, the Virginia Department of Education promoted incorporating a critical race theory lens in education. You can still find it on the Department of Education's website, still there. In February 2019, a superintendent memo for the Virginia Department of Education promoted critical race theory and the idea of white fragility.
It's not part of the curriculum. It's not part of the curriculum. I would like to move on with you.
Senator, please don't bombard me with facts because my producer can't talk quickly enough in my ear to give me a comeback. That was pathetic. Now, parents have always known that teachers tended to be more liberal. We knew that. But the unwritten compact was always that politics would stay out of the classroom. But now the school boards are brazenly violating that understanding. And this gives license to educators and officials to openly mock parents.
If you're going to call me out, I'm going to you up. Sorry, that's just me.
They want to pick on us because they want their babysitters back.
We have the meeting open to the public right now.
Nuh-uh.
That's what Lori just said.
Great. And they know that the school boards will almost always back them up. So here's my message to the school boards and the Democrats who've been covering for them. Now, you can spend your time trying to convince yourselves or us that it's not technically CRT that you're using, but you know darn well what you've done. The type of books on your syllabus, the language you use in class, the literature you aren't assigning to your students, and your attitude toward conservative students and parents. You know it. So good for the Times' Michelle Goldberg for seeing the writing on the wall on some of these issues, but for many people, it's already too late for the public schools. It's obvious that the type of education most parents want and most kids need in a competitive world is not something they're willing to provide. So the public schools will continue to lose enrollment because the left will never back down on using the schools to push its ideology. Nor will they force the teachers' unions to take measures that would allow the schools to return to normal. That means, parents, you're going to have to continue to vote with your feet and your money. And that's the angle.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.